In the previous video, I demonstrated that you can use expressions in your group by clause, and I did that with an example where I was grouping by the first character of customers' first names. And this opens up an interesting possibility. What if I were to use a case expression in my group by clause? One of the main applications of this approach is to define your own custom groups based on some sort of conditional logic. And I'll demonstrate that with a query where what I want to obtain is to group all of my films by their length, and I want to say if the film is less than 60 minutes, that's one group. I want to say if the film is between 60 and 120 minutes, that's another group. And if the film is greater than 120 minutes or 2 hours, that's a third group. And I want a query to tell me how many films I have in each group. So how many films are short, medium, and long. So we'll be working with the film table. And what I want to say is group by, and I want to group by the output of a case expression. And I'll say when the length is less than 60, then I'll call the film short. When the length is between 60 and 120 minutes, then I want to classify that film as medium length. And then when the film is greater than 120 minutes, I'm going to classify that as long. And I'll end that case expression. If you recall from the previous videos, if I've got some expression that I've got in my group by clause, I can now copy that entire expression up into the select. So I'll do that now. And I'll just close the results window so it's not in the way. And what I want to do for each group is I want to obtain a count. Let's add a semicolon to the end and let's run that query. And what the results are showing me is that I've got 445 medium length films, 456 long films, and 97 short films. And the way I accomplished this custom grouping was by using a case expression in my group by. Notice though that there's one group that's null, and that's because there are some films that have a null length. And if you recall from our previous discussions, when you've got a case expression and none of the conditions match, there's an implied else that returns null. And so that's what's happened here. When the length has been null, none of these three conditions has matched, so the case expression has evaluated to null. I'd like to get rid of that now from my output though, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if the film doesn't have a defined length, if the film length is null, I'm just going to classify that as short. So I'll put in else short, and I'll just close this results window again so it's not in the way. Let's run that query. Uh-oh, we got an error. Why did we get an error? What just happened? What happened was there's an element in the select clause that isn't inside an aggregate function, and it's also not in my group by. So what's the difference? What's missing? It's this new bit that I just introduced now, this else short. It's here in my group by, but it's not in my select. And so it actually doesn't match. And so this is something that you need to be careful of when you've got a very complex expression in your group by clause. You need to make sure if you want to select on that, you need to select the entire expression exactly as it appears in the group by. So let's fix that up. Okay, now it's identical and that should run. It can be a little bit cumbersome though, having to always repeat that same whole expression in two different places, especially when it's a very complex expression. So what I'm going to show you now is just a very shorthand notation. You shouldn't use this too often, but for situations like this, it's really convenient. What I can do is instead of repeating that whole case expression, I can just say group by 1. And you'll see that we get the same result. What this group by 1 is doing is actually referring to the position of the element in the select clause and just saying repeat that here. It's just a shorthand, convenient notation. It hasn't fundamentally changed how the query works in any way. When you see group by 1 like this, you can just imagine, take whatever is the first element that's been selected, so this entire expression, and paste it here. That's what it's doing. That's what it's equivalent to behind the scenes. So it's referring to the numerical position of the selected element. So for example, if you were to say 2 here, then 2 would be referring to this, because this is the second element that we're selecting in our select clause. We can also use case statements inside aggregate functions, and this enables us to do something that's really interesting. It's a pivoting kind of operation that opens up the door to some very interesting types of calculations. Let's say that we wanted to write a query that gave us a count of the films that are rated R or NC-17, so films that are really only suitable for adults, in one column. And then in some other columns, we wanted to count different types of conditions. So maybe we wanted another column that counted when the film is G or PG. Maybe the third column, we want a total count. And then even in the fourth column, we could do something like the percentage of films that are R or NC-17. Using a case statement inside an aggregate function will allow us to do this. So we'll just work with the film table again. We'll say select from film. And what we want to select is sum. And we'll now put a case expression inside this sum function. Case when rating in R NC-17, then 1, else 0, end. And I'll just alias that as adult films. And I'll add another column, which is just the count of the total number of films. Add a semicolon and run that. So that's telling me that there were 404 films that were rated R or NC-17. If you don't believe me, let's just go ahead and quickly check that in a separate query. Let's run that. And that gave us 404 as well. So going back to that first query, we know that it was right. So how did this work? What actually happened here? Well, for every rating in our film table, what happened using this case expression is that when the rating was either R or NC-17, this case expression output 1, otherwise it output 0. If you then sum that up completely, what you're doing is summing up all of the ones, which is all of the ratings that gave you R or NC-17. We were able to effectively count the number of rows that matched some sort of condition. And because we've set up our columns in this way, we can now do percentages as well. So let's say that we wanted to add a third column now that gave us the percentage of films that were adult films. And I can do that as follows. And I'll just copy this first expression, which gave me the number of adult films, and I'll divide by the total number of films. And I'll just alias that as %. And that went a bit off, that's fine. Let's run that. Okay, so that's saying 40.4% of our films that we have in stock are adult films. This approach of having the case expression inside the aggregate function sum is quite common. Something you'll also see people doing sometimes is rather than using sum, what they'll do is use the count function. And what they'll say is case when rating in this, then 1, else null. And running that, you get exactly the same output. And if you remember, that's because the count function, when it's given an expression, will ignore nulls. You can actually even simplify this a little bit more, because if you recall, when you have a case expression, there's an implied else null part if you leave it off. So you can even drop this part and run that, and you get the same result again. Whenever you're using a case expression inside an aggregate function to achieve this sort of effect, feel free to use the sum approach or the count approach, it doesn't matter. Postgres even actually gives you an even cleaner and simpler way to do the same thing. So let me show you the Postgres way of doing the same thing. What I can do is I can say select, so from film, and I'll leave the original query up the top just so you can compare it and see that it's a bit simpler and cleaner. What I can say is count star, and I'll say filter, and then I'll say where rating in R NC-17, and I'll classify that as adult films. Running that. And so that's achieved exactly the same effect, but it's a little bit clearer and it's a little bit easier to read, isn't it? We just say count star, filter, And then inside these parentheses, you add whatever sort of where clause you want to filter the rows as you want. So for example, I could add another row, which is count star, filter, and let's say I want to obtain a count of films where the rating is G and the length is greater than 120 minutes. So I'll write $20, and I'll just alias that as mixed. Running that, there's 72 films. So you can use either approaches. If you want to use this approach, this is the standard SQL approach. If you're working with a Postgres database, you can use this filter keyword, and you can do it this way, which is a bit simpler and easier to read.